Midway through 2005, while I was working on WRC television, I was approached by the Skoda team manager at the time, wondering whether I would be interested in getting Colin McRae interested for us both to come along and do a couple of rallies with the team. After a discussion with Colin, and he thought, yeah, it's a great idea, and we were going to start with Rally GB, and then we were going to lead into Rally Australia, just 2 events at the end of the 2005 season. The Skoda sort of promised a lot, and up to that point had never really delivered anything good for the team as such. So we thought, yeah, we'll give it a try. So after some negotiation and discussion, Rally GB was looming, and they gave us the opportunity to do a 4-day test up in Scotland, which was very interesting, learning the car and so on and so forth. But it was quite evident from Colin's perspective that a lot of work was needed on the suspension and geometry, and also on the mapping of the active diffs and what have you. So literally in 4 days of testing, we'd whacked out something like 1,500 kilometers, which was unheard of for them. They'd never done so much. But while Colin was going through the motions of setting up diffs and everything else, the engineer at that time really was desperate to try this active anti-roll bar for the front. And Colin said, well, no, hang on a minute. Until you get the base setting right, do we start bolting things on to try and make it faster? We just carried on ploughing through it and, making alterations here, making alterations there. And progressively, the car was getting faster. And for Colin, actually, he said it was really beginning to feel a lot better. So at the end of the second day, we had our debrief in the motorhome, and joining us on that test, and the first time he'd ever been to a test, was Gerhard from Riga. Now, he had never been to a Skoda test before, and basically, because Colin was driving, he thought, right, I'm going to go. So Colin said, right, listen guys, I need to get some more camber on the rear of the car. So the engineer said, no, we've maxed out on camber, we can't go anymore. And then all of a sudden, Gerhard just puts his hand up and said, I can get you some more camber on the rear. And the engineer sort of said, how do you think you're going to do that? And he said, well, if we disconnect this bolt and that bolt and then adjust the camber using some of my damper shims, if we put one of my damper shims in here, he said, and then put it back together, we'll get some more camber. And he said, oh yeah, that could work. So, right, the plan was set for the next day. We'd go and do our initial runs just to get a base time, and then first thing we were going to try was this extra camber. Lo and behold, this extra camber went down the road and came back. All of a sudden, bang, 1 second quicker again. So it was really getting somewhere, but we couldn't go much more than we'd done. So we'd made great improvements nonetheless.
To be honest, from the first time we set that quick time, he was back straight away, from what I remember anyway. And you know what it's like until you really get in the heat of competition, until we actually start mixing it with the likes of Sebastian Loeb, Marcus Gronholm, Petter Solberg. You don't really know where you are.
We've gone through everything with, from tyre, suspension, the differential stuff. So we've been going through all the different menus and options and coming up with a bit of my own stuff and trying it against their sort of best setups. So learning a lot about the car, and slowly today getting towards what I would call a base setup.
And the strong points of the Skoda?
The strong points, I mean, the main thing is the car feels good. It's quite consistent. It doesn't, the sort of worst thing, if you get into a new car and there's some really sort of bad trait that you can't dial out, then you've got a problem. But the car feels really quite nice, consistent. To gauge the speed of it's very difficult, but it certainly feels quite quick when we go down there.
So after this 1,500 kilometre test, we were quite happy. The suspension was working well, car was working well. And to be fair, Colin felt that it was a lovely little package, the whole dimension of the car, the wheels propped on each corner. It just lent itself to be a really good rally car. But it was underdeveloped, it was all functional and it was all there. It just needed more work. So off we set to Wales Rally GB. Now, we were pretty realistic when we get to this rally. We hadn't done anything for over a year and a half, or Colin hadn't driven a World Championship for a year and a half. So, you know, he wasn't going to sort of shout his mouth off he was going to finish here or there or wherever. It was just a case of, right, let's just bed ourselves in to doing what we could on the rally. But the build-up to the event was something else. This is the press and the PR. And basically, we were pulled from pillar to post, and there was, you know, all the nationals up in London. They all wanted to have a story. So Colin spoke to the PR guy and said, well, listen, you know, when we've done this before with Ford or with Subaru, you know, we've always booked a hotel up in London and brought everybody together, do a general press conference and then individual interviews after that. So they set this up, and we stayed in Soho Hotel in London, nice spot, and brought all these journalists together. And, you know, it was quite funny, having done the recce and getting to the start of the event. The main PR manager for Skoda was there, and he said that on the build-up to Rally GB, they'd had more press and PR than they'd had in the previous 26 years of rallying. That was the power that Colin brought to the whole team, and it made a big, big difference to the whole PR machine. So off we set in the rally, and we started unfortunately with a big stage in Breckfast, and you know, we'd lost 41 seconds in just over 20 Ks. So, you know, it was the right thing to do for Colin, just to bed himself in and start slowly. But progressively the speed got better and better and better. And, you know, we set some good stage times, but you know, the rally, in the end, we did finish 7th overall, but it was a sad event because that was the unfortunate event where Marco Martin and Michael Park had an off, and unfortunately Beef got killed in the accident. So it was a bit of a sad ending to a normal Rally GB. But we had one more event to go with the car, and we went off to Australia. Now, Australia was, you know, when it was over on the west coast, was a very different rally to anything else. And the surface was very hard packed, but it had this round ball bearing gravel. And quite literally, it was like driving on a bed of ball bearings. The car was floating around all over the place. And at that time, you could cut tyres, and we were cutting tyres to hold the stones in and getting grip off from stone on stone. But the other thing that made it tricky, the woods that we were using were just tracks made through the middle of trees. So, you know, you'd have trees smack on the side of the road, which for a lot of people was very disconcerting. But for Colin, with his car control, he had a lot of confidence. And in fairness, we started reasonably well. And I think certainly, was it after day one or going into day two, we actually got up to 3rd overall with Petter Solberg and Sebastian Loeb in front of us. So in fairness, you know, we were doing really well. So we went into the second day, and there was some retirements again. I think Petter went out, Sebastian Loeb went out, but we were overtaken by Francois Duval in the Citroën. So we were now 2nd overall. So, you know, at the service at the end of the second day, you could imagine the smiles in the Skoda service camp where, you know, everybody was beaming. Of course, you had Armin Schwarz, who was their #1 driver and had been for one sort of number of years. He was off to one side, and we had our guys. And we had a young engineer who was put into this position of running us, which, you know, at the end of the day, when we were heading to, at that time, was Skoda's best ever result, you know, the inexperience of this guy, unfortunately, did cause an issue, but we'll come to that in a minute. So we had a great sort of evening. We put the car in parc ferme, went to bed, woke up the next morning all full of the joys of spring or summer in Australia. So we went through the first group of 3 stages, And we always found on the tyres we were on, the tyres we used, and it was Michelin, was always much, much better on a cleaner surface. So we had Harry Rovanperä behind us, and Harry on Pirellis had better grip in the more gravelly kind of surface, and he overtook us only by a few seconds. We actually then went back to service in third overall, but we were confident that would turn around with our Michelin tyres after in the sort of final loop of 3. So we were sat having a coffee, chatting away, and then the main engineer came up to me and he said, Nick, he said, we need you to go to the time control. So we were quite taken aback, like, yeah, but why? And he said, well, the engineer, the young engineer that we had, checked the data at the end of day 2 and looked at the clutch measurement, and it read quite well. But unfortunately, Armin's car, the reading was correct, and they were changing the clutch on his car. Now, if you're going to change it anywhere, 45-minute service, you would change it there. Easily done, and it should have been done the night before. But he didn't do it then. For whatever reason, he didn't think, hang on, they're changing their clutch. We'll change the clutch here. We're on the verge of our best result. And it never happened. We came back in after the first loop, and then there was this panic. My God, the clutch could go at any time. So now they only had something like a 20-minute service. So these mechanics that we had that weren't necessarily, they were good, very good mechanics, but not necessarily the experienced guys that were on Armin's car that perhaps could have handled the pressure a little bit better. But they now were forced to have to try and change this clutch in 20 minutes. So off I went, walked to the time control, expecting this to be a little bit last minute. You know, I was looking at my watch and, wow, the time's getting close, and, you know, God, we passed our minute. And then the watch kept going, and then the film crew were with me as well, WRC television. They said, how's it going, Nick? And I said, well, we're 2 minutes late now. Eventually, 16 minutes came, still no car. So I said, right, that's it, guys, we're OTL. So when I actually walked back to service, I walked around the back way, I walked through to the front, and the guys were working on their car still, and out on the roadway beyond the border of our service park, there was Mitsubishi, there was Subaru, there was Citroen, there was whoever. All the teams were there watching what was happening with these guys changing the clutch. They sensed the frustration for these poor mechanics as well. So we ended up in a situation where we were out of the rally, but these guys were still working away trying to do it. And in the panic, when they went to fit the clutch, they dropped the clutch pack on the floor and everything was out of alignment. They had to get another clutch, put it back in. Eventually, they put it back in, connected everything up again, dropped it down on its wheels, started it, reversed it a metre and pulled it forward a metre, parked up, and then these guys just run out of the back of the service park into the private area. And to be honest, it was, I've never seen so much, you know, these guys were bitterly upset. They were crying, they were throwing stuff around out the back, you know, and they were totally distraught. They were on the verge of the best ever result for Skoda in the World Rally Championship, a second place potentially, and who knows, if Duval had a problem, we could have finished first. Wow, that would have been a story, but as it was, he got through. But the whole event was destroyed, and literally it was just perhaps this inexperienced engineer. He should have thought, no, we changed the clutch tonight no matter what, and then everything would have been sweet and rosy. But as it was a wasted opportunity for the team. And, you know, that was a retirement that happened 20 years ago, and for Skoda Motorsport, they didn't really recover after that. You know, the team was more or less disbanded. Cars and spares were passed to Armin to run his own team, but Skoda then pulled out of the higher echelons of the sport. You know, and that was the end of the Skoda Fabia. But it really was a car that was underdeveloped, but had tremendous potential, and it could have been a rally winner.
Into 3 left, plus opens, into 6 left.